Long before the public fractures, bitter interviews, and family divisions became impossible to ignore. One royal had supposedly already seen the danger coming. Princess Anne did not raise her voice or demand attention. But behind palace doors, her quiet warning may have been the sentence everyone later wished they had taken seriously. At first, nothing appeared broken. The monarchy still moved with its familiar rhythm. Duties were carried out, smiles were offered, and the language of continuity remained untouched. Yet beneath that calm surface, there was a growing sense that something unpredictable had entered the royal system. Not a scandal. Not yet. Something more difficult to define. A clash of expectations. Anne had spent her entire life inside that system. She understood its rewards, but also its demands. Duty came before comfort. Discipline came before emotion. Personal frustration was expected to disappear behind public responsibility. Anne had never needed applause to justify the work, and she had little patience for anything that threatened to turn royal service into personal theater. That was why her supposed concern about Meghan was more complicated than simple dislike. Anne was said to have questioned whether someone shaped by independence, ambition, and a modern public identity could ever feel comfortable inside an institution built on restraint. The monarchy did not simply ask people to join it. It asked them to surrender part of themselves to it. Others reportedly saw the situation differently. Harry was happy. The family wanted to appear welcoming. A new marriage offered the promise of energy, relevance, and a fresh beginning. To some, Anne's caution may have seemed unnecessarily severe, another example of her hard-edged loyalty to tradition. But Harry was looking at Meghan through the eyes of someone in love. Anne, in this dramatized telling, was looking at the situation through the eyes of someone who had watched the institution survive for decades. Harry saw someone he wanted to protect. Anne saw a system that could become dangerously exposed if emotion ever began overruling structure. And what made her warning unsettling was not its volume. It was its precision. She was not predicting a single argument or one difficult adjustment. She was supposedly questioning whether two completely different ideas of loyalty could survive under the same roof. So what exactly did Anne believe was coming? And according to the version of events now being reconsidered, Anne's concern was not about one woman entering the family. It was about what would happen when two completely different definitions of royal life collided. The first danger, in Anne's imagined warning, was not scandal. It was expectation. Meghan entered a world where nearly everything was controlled by precedent, hierarchy, and silence. Anne allegedly feared that someone accustomed to personal independence would eventually discover that royal status came with privileges, but very little genuine freedom. That was the collision Anne supposedly recognized before it became obvious to everyone else. Inside royal life, almost nothing was casual. Seniority mattered. Timing mattered. Who spoke first, who stood where, who attended which engagement. Even who appeared beside whom could carry meaning far beyond the moment itself. To outsiders, these details might look old-fashioned. Inside the institution, they were part of how order was preserved. Meghan, in this dramatized version, represented something very different. She had a public identity before royal life, her own voice, her own ambitions, and an instinct for personal expression. Anne's model was almost the opposite. Arrive, do the work, avoid drama, and never allow yourself to become more important than the duty. That difference did not automatically make either side wrong. But Anne allegedly believed compatibility mattered more than charm. A person could be intelligent, popular, hardworking, and still struggle inside a system that demanded conformity in ways few newcomers truly understood. Some younger royals may have seen Meghan as a chance to modernize the monarchy. Others reportedly saw uncertainty. Anne, shaped by decades of service, was imagined as asking a colder question. Could someone who valued independence accept a life where even personal choices could become institutional matters. Harry made that question more explosive. He was determined not to watch another woman he loved be consumed by royal pressure. Every criticism could feel threatening. Every restriction could feel unfair. Every palace instruction could begin to sound less like protocol and more like control. And that, according to Anne's supposed concern, was where the real danger started. If Harry began measuring every disagreement by how it affected Meghan personally, then ordinary royal tensions could take on a different meaning. A scheduling dispute might feel like disrespect. A protocol decision might feel like punishment. Silence might feel like abandonment. Once frustration became personal, Anne allegedly feared that the palace would no longer be seen as a difficult institution. It would be seen as an enemy. But the most unsettling part of Anne's alleged warning was not that Meghan might struggle with royal rules. It was that Harry, trying to protect her, might begin breaking those rules himself. Anne's imagined concern soon shifted away from Meghan entirely. The real vulnerability was Harry. A prince who had spent years carrying resentment, grief, and suspicion of palace machinery had now found someone he desperately wanted to protect. And that emotional instinct could become stronger than loyalty to the institution itself. Harry had always belonged to the monarchy. But belonging did not mean peace. He understood its rituals, its obligations, and its power. Yet he also carried memories that made him deeply suspicious of what happened when the institution closed ranks. In this dramatized account, Anne supposedly understood something others preferred not to confront. Meghan had not created those feelings. She had given them somewhere to go. That changed the meaning of every disagreement. A problem with staff was no longer simply administrative. A schedule change could feel deliberate. A dispute over press strategy could become evidence that the palace was not protecting Meghan. Questions about protocol, access, hierarchy, or who had final authority began carrying an emotional weight far greater than the issue itself. Harry believed he was defending his wife from pressures he had seen before. Anne's imagined position was colder, but no less serious. She believed royal duty required endurance, silence, and the ability to absorb personal frustration without allowing it to destabilize the institution. Harry increasingly seemed to believe the opposite. If the institution could not protect the people inside it, then loyalty to that institution had limits. That difference was becoming dangerous. Charles could understand his son's pain while fearing the consequences of indulging every grievance. William could sympathize with Harry while also seeing how quickly family tension could threaten stability. Both were trapped between brother, son, husband, heir, and institution. The palace reportedly hoped time would soften everything. That may have been its greatest miscalculation. Because resentment rarely disappears when people feel unheard. It hardens. Each unresolved dispute becomes proof of the last one. Each silence begins to look intentional. And Anne, in this speculative telling, supposedly saw the family moving toward a point where Harry would stop treating these conflicts as private frustrations and start viewing them as evidence of something fundamentally wrong. Once that happened, keeping disagreements behind palace doors would become far more difficult. The next battle would not simply be over what had happened. It would be over whose version of what happened the world would believe. Because once Harry stopped asking whether the palace could change, and started asking whether the palace had failed them, the conflict moved into territory Anne had supposedly feared from the beginning. Royal families survive scandal through one weapon above all others: silence. But silence only works when everyone agrees to maintain it. Anne's alleged warning now seemed terrifyingly relevant, because the dispute was no longer about private frustration. It was becoming a battle over who had the right to define what had happened. For generations, the monarchy had depended on restraint. Problems were contained, statements were measured, and private disagreements were expected to remain exactly that, private. The system was designed to survive pressure, by refusing to feed it. But in this dramatized version of events, that old method was beginning to fail because the people at the center of the conflict no longer agreed on what silence meant. To Anne, silence represented discipline. It protected the institution from emotional reactions that could never be taken back. To Harry and Meghan, however, that same silence could feel very different. If they believed they had been misunderstood, misrepresented, or left exposed, then saying nothing was no longer dignity. It could feel like surrender. That difference widened the fracture. Every news story in the press created another dilemma. Respond, and the palace risked giving the controversy more oxygen. Stay quiet, and Harry could interpret the silence as proof that nobody intended to defend them. Public statements, rumored briefings, interviews, and friends speaking from the edges of the dispute began to blur the line between family tension and public warfare. Anne, in this fictionalized telling, remained outwardly restrained. She did not need to dominate the conversation. She simply watched the pattern she had supposedly feared begin to take shape. And gradually, others inside the family may have started remembering the warnings that once sounded too severe. What happened if private anger became public testimony? What happened if every old disagreement was pulled into a larger story about loyalty, neglect, favoritism, and betrayal? That was when the palace faced a more dangerous realization. The threat was no longer one argument, one interview, or even one family rupture. It was the possibility that private grievances, institutional secrets, and personal resentments could become fused together until nobody could separate emotion from fact or perception from motive. Control was slipping, and once the public started choosing which version to believe, the monarchy could no longer decide how the story ended. And when Harry and Meghan finally stepped away from the center of royal life, Anne's old warning reportedly took on a darker meaning, because leaving the institution did not end the conflict. It changed the battlefield. The departure was supposed to create distance. Instead, it shattered the illusion that royal disagreements could always be contained. Suddenly, the question Anne had allegedly raised years earlier returned with brutal force. What happens when someone leaves the royal machine but keeps the title, the history, and the global attention? This was the moment the conflict changed shape. What had once been emotional tension inside a family was now becoming an institutional problem with consequences far beyond personal hurt. Roles had to be defined. Titles carried new weight. Questions about security, finances, public representation, and commercial independence could no longer be treated as private matters. In this dramatized version, Anne was less concerned with who had offended whom than with what precedent might be created. Royal privilege had always rested on an unwritten exchange. Status came with duty, access came with restraint, and public recognition came with obligations to the crown. If someone could step away from those obligations while still carrying the authority and symbolism of royal identity, then where exactly did the boundary end? Harry, however, could see the situation differently. He wanted distance from the machinery without surrendering who he was. He was still a prince, still part of the family, still connected to a history he could never simply erase. To him, leaving royal duties did not mean abandoning his identity. But Anne's imagined concern was that a half-in, half-out arrangement would create permanent uncertainty. Every title could become a debate. Every appearance could raise questions about representation. Family connections, inherited status, access, and even future ceremonial roles could become emotionally charged because nobody would fully agree on where family ended and institution began. That uncertainty divided the palace further. Some wanted reconciliation before the damage hardened. Others believed clear boundaries had to come first. Sentiment said, leave the door open. Institutional survival demanded rules. Anne, in this speculative telling, feared that emotion could not be allowed to decide questions that might shape the monarchy for years. Because once exceptions were made under pressure, they could become expectations later. And that was the darker possibility. The departure had not ended the crisis. It had created a second phase, one where the palace could no longer control the people at the center of the story, yet could still be affected by everything they said and did. Because the moment Harry and Meghan were outside palace control, the royal family's greatest fear changed from preventing departure to controlling what could still leave the palace with them. Inside royal life, power is rarely announced. It appears in smaller things: who receives a title, who enters a private room, who wears a historic jewel, who appears beside the sovereign, and who suddenly stops receiving invitations. Anne allegedly understood that these symbols could become weapons without anyone ever admitting it. This was where the conflict became quieter, but also more dangerous. The monarchy had always spoken through symbols. A residence could suggest trust. A patronage could signal confidence. A place in a procession could reveal rank. An invitation could confirm belonging. Even a jewel could carry more meaning than a public statement ever would. That was why questions of ownership and access mattered so much. Some pieces were personal. Others were tied to family inheritance, royal collections, or traditions larger than any one individual. In this dramatized telling, Anne supposedly understood how quickly those distinctions could become emotional once relationships inside the family began to fracture. Jewels, especially, could become powerful symbols of acceptance. What a royal woman was permitted to wear could suggest continuity, confidence, even silent approval from the institution itself. But when those symbols disappeared, changed hands, or were simply no longer available, the absence could become almost as meaningful as the object. Anne's imagined warning was that privileges should never become bargaining tools. Titles, jewels, residences, and ceremonial access could not be used to settle emotional scores without creating consequences that would outlive the original dispute. After Meghan stepped away, the meaning of those symbols changed. What had once represented belonging could now underline separation. At the same time, Catherine's growing ceremonial position placed her ever closer to the center of royal continuity, making comparisons inevitable whether anyone wanted them or not. Then came the inheritance questions: Diana's legacy, family jewelry, titles, the future roles of Harry's and William's children. Every object and designation seemed capable of carrying another layer of memory, resentment, or expectation. Anne, in this speculative version, feared that ambiguity would keep reopening old wounds. If nobody agreed on what royal status meant after departure, then every privilege could trigger another argument about loyalty, entitlement, and belonging. And slowly, the family was approaching something even harder to repair than status itself. Yet the jewels, titles, and invitations were only visible symbols. Beneath them lay the issue Anne was said to care about most, and once trust disappeared, no royal privilege could restore it. Families can survive arguments. Institutions can survive embarrassment. But both struggle to survive when every private conversation feels potentially temporary. Anne's alleged warning was now being remembered for its most uncomfortable prediction. If trust collapsed, even attempts at reconciliation could become dangerous, because nobody would know what might remain confidential. That was the deeper wound. The conflict was no longer only about what had been said publicly. It was about what could still be said privately without fear. In this dramatized version, senior royals might begin measuring every conversation with Harry more carefully. Not because affection had disappeared, but because confidence had weakened. A personal exchange could no longer feel completely personal if there was even a chance it might later become part of a larger public argument. From Harry's side, the logic could be just as emotional. If he believed the palace would never correct the story as he saw it, then speaking openly might feel less like betrayal and more like self-defense. Silence, to him, could mean allowing someone else to define his motives, his marriage, and even his memories. That trapped both sides in the same destructive cycle. The more guarded the family became, the more excluded Harry could feel. The more excluded he felt, the more determined he might become to explain himself. Every reaction confirmed the other side's suspicion. Even family gatherings could carry a new tension. Ordinary conversations, invitations, absences, seating arrangements, and private exchanges might suddenly feel loaded with meaning. Nothing had to be openly hostile for everyone to sense that trust had changed. Anne, in this speculative telling, was not imagined as without compassion. She could understand Harry's pain while still rejecting the way that pain was being expressed. To her, reconciliation required discretion. But that was precisely the problem. Reconciliation needed privacy at the exact moment privacy had become difficult to trust. Charles faced the cruelest balance of all. As a father, he could want contact and healing. As monarch, he had to protect the institution. William faced something different, but equally serious. He could no longer see the dispute only as a wounded relationship with his brother. He also had to consider what unresolved tensions might mean for the monarchy he would one day inherit. That was why Anne's supposed warning was being revisited with new urgency. The issue had moved beyond scandal, and as the Crown began thinking beyond today's headlines toward William's future reign, Anne's old concerns stopped sounding like family criticism and started sounding like a warning about succession itself. The monarchy does not think in news cycles. It thinks in reigns. That is why Anne's supposed warning matters even more now. The question is no longer how Charles manages a wounded family, but what unresolved loyalties, titles, resentments, and expectations could eventually be inherited by William. That changes the scale of everything. What once looked like a deeply personal conflict between brothers can become something larger when one of those brothers is moving steadily toward the center of the crown. William is not only carrying his own feelings about Harry, he is also carrying the responsibility of protecting the structure he may one day lead. And that is where Anne's imagined concern becomes more strategic. Harry and William are brothers, but in this dramatized telling, they now represent two very different relationships with royal life. William's path moves deeper into duty, hierarchy, and institutional continuity. Harry's path has moved outside that structure, while his emotional connection to the family remains impossible to erase. That tension does not simply disappear with time. Archie and Lilibet remain connected to the royal story through blood, titles, history, and family identity. Questions about access, belonging, ceremonies, and future roles could therefore return again and again. Every major milestone has the potential to reopen uncertainty. Catherine's growing position adds another layer. As she becomes more closely associated with stability, service, and the future monarchy, public comparisons with Meghan may become harder to avoid. Those comparisons could deepen old divisions even when nobody inside the family intends them to. Anne's supposed position, however, is not about punishment. It is about consistency. The same rules must apply regardless of emotion, popularity, or pressure. Because once royal boundaries change according to personal circumstances, every future decision becomes harder to defend. That creates difficult choices ahead. Coronations, funerals, weddings, family milestones, inherited jewels, ceremonial roles. Each occasion could force William to decide where affection ends and institutional responsibility begins. And that may become the true test. Could William restore a relationship with Harry without reopening the ambiguity that Anne allegedly feared from the beginning? Could he welcome his brother while keeping royal authority clear? Or would every act of reconciliation create a new argument over status, access, and expectation? That question has transformed Anne's old words from a forgotten private concern into something far more powerful, a framework through which the family now understands everything that followed. Years after the first unease, nobody inside the royal family needs to say that Anne was right. In fact, they may never say it at all. But the power of a warning is not measured by whether it is acknowledged. Sometimes it is measured by how often people quietly return to it. And in this dramatized telling, that is what makes Anne's supposed warning so haunting. It was never simply about Meghan. It was about what could happen when personality, celebrity, loyalty, hierarchy, and inherited duty were forced into the same narrow space. Looking back, almost every later conflict can be traced to that tension. Harry believed protection had to come before tradition. The palace believed tradition was what protected the institution. Meghan sought room for a personal voice. The monarchy demanded restraint. Neither side needed to see itself as the aggressor for the relationship to begin breaking apart. Anne is not imagined standing above the wreckage in triumph. There would be nothing satisfying about watching a warning come true when the cost was paid by her own family. Harry lost trust. Meghan lost any simple relationship with royal life. Charles was left balancing the instincts of a father against the obligations of a monarch. William inherited not only responsibility, but a fractured bond with his brother. Catherine's position became increasingly tied to continuity, while every comparison with Meghan carried the possibility of reopening old wounds. Even the symbols remained complicated. Titles, invitations, ceremonies, jewels, family milestones. Each could still become a reminder that affection and royal status were no longer easily separated. The monarchy, in this speculative narrative, learned from that uncertainty. Boundaries became more important. Expectations had to be clearer. Any future reconciliation would need something the family once avoided defining. Exactly what belonging means when someone is family but no longer part of the working institution. And that may be the final twist. Anne's warning was not necessarily about one dramatic departure. It may have been about a problem capable of surviving into another reign. Royal history often remembers the loudest argument. But sometimes the words that matter most are the ones spoken before anyone realized there was a crisis. And that may be why, after everything that has happened, the palace is no longer asking whether Anne's warning was too harsh, but whether anyone truly understood how far its consequences could reach.